Good evening. I usually try to be concise when I have the assignment of introducing a speaker, but with Najmieh Batmanglij, and I've pronounced that, right? Okay. It's an exercise in condensation, given her work and her life story. It's extraordinary. I could go on longer than she's been asked for her allotted time, but I won't. Try to be concise and get it down to the essence. Najmieh's story is a great American story, as well as a Persian Iranian story. She and her husband, Mohammed, fled Iran in 1979, subsequently had 2 sons, made a great home in America. A couple of years ago, The New Yorker did an article on the extraordinary creativity of their sons and asked about how that came to be and what kind of home environment they had. One of their sons, who loved music, founded an indie rock band with his friends from Columbia, and it's one of the most successful in the world, won the Grammy Award this year, and it's called, has the wonderful name of Vampire Weekend. Another son is a young but celebrated Hollywood movie director. They have conducted a flourishing publishing business from their home, where the kids were brought up, about 100 books in English about Persian subjects. And the name of the company is Mage, M-A-G-E, which comes from an earlier word meaning bounty, and it came, of course, to mean magic, and I guess flowed into the Greek. Last night, we were privileged, my wife and I, to go to dinner at the home of Bijan Ardahali, who is Persian and who's here, and his wife Jennifer Wolford, and we ate a vast number of dishes from Najmieh's wonderful cookbook, which is really the authoritative book on Persian cuisine. And at the end, Mohammed read Persian poetry, at least one extremely wonderful, raunchy piece. And it seems that it's very traditional and admired to recite poetry in connection with feasting in Persian culture. So cuisine is a lens into culture and the reverse, and the marriage of food and poetry in Persian cuisine is one indication of the special emphasis that society gives to both things. In fact, the subtitle of Najmieh's great book on Persian cuisine is Ancient Persian and Modern Iranian Cooking and Ceremonies. And indeed, it appears that virtually all Persian ceremonies are accompanied by food and occur around food or with food. So I thought I'd just finish with a quote from the introduction to that book from another author who she quoted, and that author was talking about how the images of female beauty in Persian writing and speech often are derived from food. And this is what the author said. Moon-faced beauties have almond-shaped eyes, peachy complexions, pistachio-like mouths, jube-colored lips. We'll need some interpretation of that. Hazelnut-like noses, red apple cheeks, and lemon or pomegranate-like breasts. So without further ado, I give you Najmieh Batmanglij.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I would like to thank Peter Beanstalk. No, it doesn't work? Okay. Okay. We start again. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I would like to thank Peter Beanstalk for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. As a matter of fact, you know more about Persian food than you might think when you ask for oranges, pistachios, quince, spinach, peaches, or saffron. You are using words derived from the Persian that refer to foods either originated in the region or introduced from there. For Persia was a great entrepot of the ancient and medieval worlds. The land was the first home of many common herbs and familiar preparations such as khoreshte, fesenjun, which is a combination of walnut and pomegranate. It's a sweet and sour. Kebabs and almond pastries. Persian food has had 1,000 years of change and refinement, but still retained roots in its ancient sources. It has one of the oldest schools of cooking, and yet it is least known in the West, and I want to make sure it does not remain that way. Iran was positioned at the center of the Silk Road, looking both to China in the east and Italy in the west. For centuries, along with the silk and other trade goods, vegetable, fruits, spices, and cooking techniques passed from one civilization to another to be absorbed and transformed into local specialties. This process of mutual enrichment shaped the cuisines of the countries along the Silk Road in profound ways. I was born in Iran, and as a child, I always loved to cook, but my mother would not allow me in her kitchen. She would say, go to university, get your education, you will have plenty of time to cook, and she was right. I came to the US for my college education when I was 18. After 7 years, I returned to Iran and handed my master's degree to my mother, and she allowed me in her kitchen. My mother was an excellent cook and herbalist who raised a large family, mostly with home remedies. I learned all I could from my mother, but she was a salé cook, which means she did not cook pastry. So she sent me to my aunt. She was a wonderful pastry cook. My aunt had never shared her cooking secrets with anyone, but she decided to teach me. I kept a diary and recorded all the recipes I learned, and I learned a lot. After the Islamic Revolution, 1979, my husband and I left for France because Iranians did not need visa at that time. We became refugees in a small village in south of France. We were young, we had no job, no country, no papers. We did not know much French, and above all, I was pregnant with my first son, Zal. I decided to become honest with myself and follow my passion and become a cook. So I went to cooking school. To my surprise, many of the French chefs that I met on that time were interested in Persian cooking. I started to translate my mother's recipe into French. In typically Iranian fashion, I invite all our neighbors to our house and tested my recipe on them. Soon the whole village of Vans were eating Persian food. One day, one of my neighbors told me, Najmieh, why don't you do a cookbook? I said, me? Cookbook? Then I thought about it. I thought maybe I can do a scrapbook as a kind of love letters to my children. I was worried that my children would never ever know all the good things that I had experienced growing up in Iran, like the taste of the first bite of a cream puff from the Yas bakery in Tehran, the taste of my mother's quince jam on hot, fresh Barbary bread with a sweet tea in the morning, the taste of creamy, stretchy, saffron-flavored ice cream, the earthy taste of chagale badum, baby green almonds sprinkled with coarse salt and wrapped in newspaper cone by the vendors outside our school, the heavenly taste of fresh walnut of Sarepol, just picked succulent sweet white mulberries, all the excitement of family gatherings, baking cookies, germinating seeds, coloring eggs to celebrate the Persian New Year. I want my children to know about these simple pleasures of my childhood in Iran. So, with the help of our neighbors, my scrapbook with 50 recipes became a manuscript. And pretty soon, I had a French publisher. The publisher said, "We need some photos." I remember calling the only photographer in our village who mainly took photos of painters and galleries. He was supposed to come at 10 a.m., but in typically south of France fashion, he turned up at lunchtime. I invited him to have lunch with us and told him about my cookbook project. He told me, "Najmieh, if you feed me every day like that, I'll do your photos." He remained a friend and a photographer for my next 5 cookbooks. The book was published in Paris by Grandcher. I call it Ma Cuisine d'Iran. Writing this book happened organically. I did not know what I was doing. It was not easy, and there were many challenges. I remember writing the recipe was a nightmare. But when I held the first copy of the book, I said, "This is a job I want, because I can get paid for something I really love to do." In 1983, my husband and I immigrated to the United States, and I started to write my first cookbook in English. I sent the manuscript to many publishers, but none were interested in Persian food. We decided to publish the book ourselves. So we created Mage Publishers. And my cookbook was our first book. I called it Food of Life, Noosh Jan in Persian, which is a traditional wish that a dish will be enjoyed, much like Bon Appetit in French. To my surprise, I received a very positive response and good reviews for the book. The feedback encouraged and inspired me to begin serious research in Persian cooking. I consulted Iranian scholars and read everything that was available and related to food, from ancient texts to medieval and contemporary Persian literature and poetry. And I also read all the travelogue and looked into Persian art and archaeology and collect whatever was available and related to food. I studied all the Persian cookbook from the Abbasi's court, Cuisine of 10th century to present time. I found out that people living on the Iranian plateau had always been foodies, from the Caspian to the Persian Gulf. Look at these beautifully made 5,000-year-old ceremonial drinking vessels in the form of bowl from Elam in what is present-day Khuzestan in southern Iran. We also know from cuneiform tablets deciphered by Jean Bottero, a French archaeologist who was also cordon bleu cook, that Elamite had an elaborated cuisine. For example, they had 30 types of cheese and many types of bread shaped in the form of women's breast and men's hands. Here we have a 4,000 years old recipe from turnip soup with lots of onion and garlic very much like mung bean soup in Persian cooking. This pot with its hanging ladle tells us a lot about the people of Marlik, a 3,000 years old civilization by the Caspian, not far from Tehran. They must have a very refined style of cooking to have a pot like this. Look at this mortar and pestle spout, also from Marlik. I assume they crushed olive and pomegranate in it, which grow there wildly. They must have also loved pomegranate because their jewelry and also has a lot of pomegranate motifs, which I don't have in the picture. I should have them. The Persian inherited the cooking and art of civilization of the past: Babylon, Elam, Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Turkey. However, by 500 BCE, the Achaemenids of the First Persian Empire had developed their own cooking style. Persian cooking is usually made, this Persian baklava is usually made with almond and pistachio and glazed with honey and rosewater and flavored with cardamom. In the 5th century BCE, Herodotus gives a description of sweetmeat with almond paste very similar to this baklava. And his contemporary Xenophon wrote, "The Persians have given up none of the cooked dishes invented in former days. On the contrary, they are always devising new ones." And he also added, they kept cooks just to invent dishes, along with butlers, confectioners, cupbearers to serve at the table. It is significant that many words for the food items remain the same in Persian today as they were several thousand years ago, such as milk, honey, yogurt, cheese, wine, and bread. We know this from a poem called Darakht Asurik from the 2nd century BCE. The poem is a verbal context between a date palm and a goat, and perhaps a metaphor for the benefit of vegetarianism versus meat eating. Moving forward a few hundred years, we look at the Sasanians of the 2nd Persian Empire were also foodies. Look at this beautiful wine drinking cup. They would drink the wine from the mouth of the gazelle. Take a look at these beautifully made spoons and forks from 1400 years ago. They seem very modern to me. During this period, we know about exchange of food along the Silk Road between China and Persia. For example, that walnut, pistachio, pomegranate, cucumber, broad beans, which in China they call it Iranian beans, coriander, seeds, as well as grape wine went from Iran to China. Among the plants that came from China to Iran were peaches, apricot, tea, and rhubarb. From the 4th century, we have another remarkable written in Old Persian that tells something about the knowledge and sophistication of the Sasanian court and their attitude towards food and wine. In this tale, a young knight asked King Khosrow to admit him to the royal court and volunteers to take any test to prove his worth. King Khosrow chooses to test the young man's ability in many domains such as music, poetry, archery, and horse riding. But surprisingly, he also tests the young boy on his knowledge of food and wine. The king asked the boy, which fowl is the finest and the most savory? The boy replies, the pheasant, the gray partridge with white tail and red wings, the lark, and the male crane. But with the male domesticated duck that has been fed on hemp seeds and fattened with butter of olives, no fowl can contest. When it's killed, it must be hung by its trunk, and next day it must be hung by the neck, and then boiled and roasted on a spit. When the king asked the boy about the finest wine in Iran, the boy amazingly replied, "It is the wine of Shiraz." By the way, this is a 15th century Persian painting. You know, you see there's ducks here, right here, the same way. Another story that gives us a clue about ancient Iranian attitude towards food comes from Book of Kings, Shahnameh by Ferdowsi. According to the Book of Kings, ancient Persians had been vegetarian and killing for food was unknown to them, until the devil presented himself to King Zahak as a gourmet cook, and he prepared a series of dishes to snare the royal epicure. On the first night, he cooked a dish with egg yolk. I assume he cooked cuckoo. The second night, he prepared a meal with partridge, gray pheasant, and quail. The third night, he cooks chicken and lamb kebab mixed together, like we had at Bijan house last night. The fourth night, he marinated filet of veal in saffron, rosewater, old wine, and pure musk, and made a delicious tender kebab. That's why I call this recipe Shahnameh kebab in my cookbook. Let me read you this poem in Persian. کلید خورشخانه پادشاه بدو داد دستور فرمان روا. خورش زرده خواهی دادش دوست بدان داشت یک دل تندرست. خورش های کپک و تزور و سپید بسازید و آمد دلی پر امید. سه دیگر به مرغ و کباب و بره بیاراست خان از خورش یک سره. به روز چهارم چو بنهاد خان خورش کرده از پشت گاو جوان. پشت گاو جوان من ویل. بدو اندرون زعفرون و گلاب همان سال خورده می و مشک ناب. Even though the poet Rumi says the best recipe is hunger, he used food and wine as a metaphors in his poetry. Let me read you these poems about why wine has become forbidden. Last night somebody asked me, so I'm going to read it to you. Evil won't always come from a loss of self-control. Wine makes a person ruder, who has rudeness in his soul. A wise man, when he drinks, will seem to grow more clever. An evil-natured man will turn out worse than ever. But since most man's behavior is an absolute disgrace, wine has become forbidden to everyone, just in case. Let me read you in Persian now. نه همه جا بی خودی شرم کند، بی ادب را می چنان تر می کند. گر بود عاقل نکوفر می شود، ور بود بدخوی بدتر می شود. لیک اغلب چو بدند و ناپسند، بر همه می را محرم کردند. Another treasure that I found in Persian literature from the 15th century was Bozhaq of Shiraz, a poet and gastronome. He wrote the whole divan of poetry dedicated to Persian food. It shows the influence of Central Asia and Mongol court style of cooking in Persian food of his time. The most popular dishes were using dough, noodles, and dumpling. Compared to now, rice is dominated in Persian cooking. Under the tent, the one on the right is eating a dumpling on a stick. Look at this, right here. Dumpling called sambuse in Persian, by the way, because more elaborated in the 7th century. Here I have sweet and savory sambouse filled with lamb and spices and sprinkled on top with sugar, rose petal, and pistachio, a delicacy from the Safavids court, which I have it in my cookbook. Here I have pistachio meatballs glazed with pomegranate and grape molasses. Grape molasses and pomegranate in the 16th century, they used a lot as a sweet agent. I was inspired by Safavid cooking in the 7th century and modernized this delicious meatball for today's cook. When I say modernize, I mean I cook my meatballs in the oven. It's much easier, and in 10-15 minutes you have meatball. Even though in his poems Bozhaq praised rice with saffron, nonetheless, it took another 200 years for rice to become the crown jewel of Persian cooking. The way we cook rice today is continuation from the Safavids kitchen. Jean Chardin, a French jeweler and traveler, tells us much about food and serving style of that period. He mentions very elaborated dinner with 11 types of rice, such as jewel rice with candied orange peel, pistachio, almond, barberries, and saffron, and touch of spices. Iranian food is like Persian miniature, it's very refined. We don't over spice food. We use touch of spice, so you get the best flavor of the food. Eggplant and pomegranate rice, apricot and date rice, upside down baked rice. Moving forward a few hundred years to 19th century, in this painting of a tea ceremony in the Qajar style, we see Zolika or Zoleikha toasting Joseph with wine. And as you notice here, you have this Qajar style of pastry, the arrangement. Persian pastry become more elaborated during this period. Here I have a contemporary tea setting in Qajar style. I have told you a little of what we know about Persian food, from archaeology, painting, poetry, linguistics, and old texts. But this was not all theory for me. I have been cooking Persian food every day since 1979, when I had to leave Iran. And in my kitchen, I have tried to keep the flame of its cuisine alive despite this dark period in Iranian history. I get pleasure to know that my passion and conviction about Persian food is finally being transmitted and has inspired many enthusiastic foodies. I started my first cookbook as a love letter to my children 35 years ago, isolated in my kitchen, writing recipes, testing, retesting, shooting, reshooting photos for my cookbooks. 30 years later, my sons Zal and Rostam, now young adult, told me, "Mom, welcome to the 21st century. Your book is old and outdated." They inspire me to restructure and redesign the book for today's cook. This is with the green spine, that is their signature towards the green movement. Even though I wrote this book originally for our children, so they would know where they came from and what it had tasted like, I'm happy to know that many people are now using this book. I received emails from students around the world telling me that they get together and cook from my cookbook. They recite poetry, they tell jokes, and eat and drink as Iranians have always done. That makes me happy and keep me going. I hope you too have a chance to try this book and do the same thing. Thank you.